Welcome back, everyone, to St. Catherine's again in Houston, the 24th week in Ordinary Time. The passage from Jesus, the son of Sirach, was written around the year 180 BC, so very close to the time of Christ. And it was translated into Greek by his grandson around the year 130. The Christian community used this book, Yeshua ben Yosef, Joshua, the son of Sirach, as an introduction to good ethical and moral living for people who were joining the Christian community, for catechumens. The passage speaks about harboring and nourishing spite, vengeance, ill feeling. It poisons one, and he recommends against it. Do not nourish and hold in a tight grip your resentments. Slowly but surely, how can you ask God for forgiveness and expect God to forgive, which God does, by the way? It's not dependent on us, without extending it to others. We use the identical same language which comes up in the gospel, that we ask God to forgive us as we forgive others. And the language, if you look up your contemporary English scripture, it says, forgive us our debts, trespasses. That goes back to King Henry VIII and Cranmer's English. Actually, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven also those who are indebted to us. It's about what is owed and obligations to one another. God doesn't take us at our word in the sense of, well, if I'm unforgiving, God's not going to forgive. What happens is the forgiveness, that aspect of being, is not part of my life. And when the day comes and I look for forgiveness, hopefully, I may well believe it's not mine to receive, because I have never entered in on a life of forgiveness and compassion and mercy. Keep all three terms together. Passage from Romans is at the end of a bit of a debate Paul had with those in the church community of Corinth, who some believed that eating meat that was sacrificed in the pagan temples, there was no big deal, simply because the gods they are offering these sacrifices to don't exist in the first place. Let's get over it. There are no gooses. There are no ghosts, goblins, or ghouls, only to the extent they are in our imagination. And Paul states that those who grew up in the tradition of where this non-Jewish religion of multiple gods, they are real to those people. So while they are in that sense of still searching, don't so destroy the weak that you lose them completely. And he says, what we do for others. And the dying to self and the dying to my needs and wants is also done in the context of the needs of others. What we do to prevent the spread of coronavirus is not just done for me, it is done for others. I am included. Salvation, which comes from the term for health. The health of all is dependent upon all. So let's continue to live keeping others in our scope of care and concern. The gospel is pretty straightforward about forgiveness, and look at it, just read it, and when you get back to me, I have a few thoughts for you. See you in a minute, or two, or three, or four. Welcome back. Since the introduction was only 4.5 minutes, holy ones, And you probably didn't even have time to settle in, make yourselves comfortable, or stir your coffee, or whatever the morning or evening beverage is. Notwithstanding, the gospel is fraught with all kinds of dangerous possibilities. First and foremost, when Peter asks, Jesus, how often should I forgive? Well, of course, that kind of question is coming from a legalistic mindset. When can I put a limit on this? When is my patience exhausted? Am I off the hook after I've done it, as Peter recommends, after 7 times? Though, mind you, it's not necessarily technically 7. 7 is the Hebrew letter for, is the complete number, the number of wholeness. So the fullness of forgiveness, it's limitless. Why would you consider, 3 strikes and you're out is an example of it? We're asked to be far more patient. So Jesus turns around and takes it to the level of the ridiculous, implying that Peter's question was ridiculous. You cannot put a limit on when you stop loving, when you stop caring, when you stop being compassionate. And here it is, when you stop forgiving. Now, do not forget the passage you had last week, which had to do with when somebody sins against the family, the community, the church, you go to them one-on-one. It's done in private, it's done with respect, it's done in a non-attacking, aggressive manner. If that doesn't work, will you resort to arbitration, to a counsellor, to another person to help who can see the issue or the problem in an objective manner and helping both parties to see and to hear. We do that constantly. Parents are the arbiters of all World War II, IIIs and IVs that go on in the household and in a child's world, and maybe sometime an adult one as well. Anyway, it happens in work, it happens in school, it happens in life. And if the person does not take responsibility, is not willing to make amends, make a move in a positive direction, or respond to the outreach, well, then you cut them loose. And that was the binding and loosing. The reason I state this is, there will be many a person who will be offended, I can guarantee you, by how this gospel is preached. You must forgive no matter how many times you are offended. Say that to a person who is suffering from domestic abuse, from violence of some sort, from social abuse and violence. You should always forgive. Oh, really? Remember the passage last Sunday? If the person does not take onus for the sin committed, the crime, the offense, then you cut them loose. We're not asked to be re-victimized and re-victimized and re-victimized. That is vitally important. Otherwise, this passage can end up doing more damage than the good it intends to do. So when Peter asks, how often must I forgive? It has to do with the person who is reaching back to the one who's doing the forgiving. And it simply means you keep the door open. Now, the parable that's given is an interesting one. The text used in the American Catholic Church and American English states that the king who comes across, it says, a servant. The Greek is doulos, slave. He is a high-ranking slave. He is the finance minister. He has access to an enormous amount of money, which seemingly he now has no access to. He's either squandered, misappropriated, we do not know. But the man goes to his master, he is the slave, and asks and begs for mercy. He does him homage, the same gesture as to worship him. The king is compassionate, which is highly unusual. The king here would represent a pagan king for the simple reason the Jews of the day and the Jews in general were forbidden to sell somebody into slavery, least of all your wife or your children. So the fact that the king was threatening to do this meant he was a non-Jew. He was a pagan king. Lo and behold, the non-religious, non-Jew is the most compassionate here. Mercy and compassion do not belong to religious people only. That is the first shocking element in the story. And the listeners would have been aghast, because most emperors, kings, and lords were tyrants, despots, nasty, sick people. But this one isn't. And he forgives the debt. It would be in the realm of trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars, or euro, or whatever, meaning that what the man asks to pay back is impossible. And the association here is, we could never warrant or earn the forgiveness of God. It is graciously given, it is compassionately dispensed. We never merit it, it's not owed to us. This is who God is. That's the first element. And it's using the example of what the people of the time knew about despots, dictators, and demagogues. In this instance, this man comes across as a rather compassionate human being. Now, when the slave meets one like himself, not a superior, and I presume he must have been a fellow Jew, one like himself, he is a fellow slave. Of high ranking, but this one maybe not of high ranking. And in the exact same terminology, he asks to be forgiven the debt owed. The one who was forgiven in the most incredible, merciful manner shows no mercy whatsoever and has him thrown in prison. And the debt here is a couple of denarii, which would have been paid back in probably 6-8 months, give or take. It was a pittance in comparison. What comes up here is, how can one who, as a believer in God, understands and experiences the limitless mercy, love, and graciousness of God, would not extend that to others? Look how the extending goes. What was threatened of the slave who had the unpayable debt was that he would be thrown in prison, his wife was sold, and his children sold. What lies behind this possibly is being thrown in prison and he's being resold to another master. It's a form of punishment. Putting them in prison is exerting pain, revenge, and vindictiveness. Here he comes across somebody else, he does the exact same thing. Rather than forgiving the debt, which was small, he turns on his fellow slave in a manner that exacts strict justice. There's no care or concern. He does not care about the plight of the man's family. And I keep wondering, why did the king become so merciful to the other fellow when he mentions, a wife and children being sold? Is he moved by the fact that by so doing, the man's family is split up? He is split from his spouse. How do you think the king felt when he heard that maybe he had the capacity to separate the children from their parents? Basically, he's exacting vengeance, punishment, and suffering on the man. Because he knows he can get away with it, he's inflicting pain. Forgiveness here and compassion is broader than just forgiving an offense. So, when the man shows no compassion whatsoever for the plight of his fellow human being, what happens then is when the pagan king hears about it from the other slaves, he is outraged, and rightly so. Now, you cannot state that this is what God does, but what is being stated here is, we never earn God's forgiveness, God's mercy. It is never merited, but we can lose it. I have met people over the years, not many, thankfully, who have major issues with accepting that they have been forgiven by God. And it's not the forgiveness that is the issue, it is the acceptance of it and learning to forgive oneself. And it has to do with probably not having to extend oneself in a forgiving, compassionate, merciful mode to others, and therefore believes that he or she will be treated the same way as I or you treat others. We have limited our life and the capacity for something greater and bigger. That's the warning. So in forgiving without limit has got to do with remaining open, but being compassionate, not exacting vengeance, not being cruel, not being inhumane to your fellow human being, one who is like yourself. Question is, how do you want God to treat you who would turn a blind eye, a deaf ear, a clenched fist, and your back on your neighbour who is in need? And I have the ability to extend compassion, mercy, care, love to you. That's bigger than just being forgiven an offence. It's richer. Do not exact, and do not use your children to get back at the ex. Do not get at the grandparents because you refuse to let the grandchildren have access to them. All the ways people use others to exact vengeance. That's being put in prison and sent to the torturers. Do not make life miserable for others out of your own misery. Open up to the life that God calls us to, and that is the living of compassion, a compassionate way of being, living the mercy that God expresses to us in Christ, and experiencing it and sharing it with one another. See you next week.